There is one striking pattern in the history of ancient Rome. When Roman legions clashed with tribes that were inferior to them in terms of organization and weaponry, victory was almost always a foregone conclusion. The legion, a perfectly tuned machine built on discipline and engineering genius, seemed invincible. Roman weapons did not simply inflict defeat. They erased differences, turning enemies into part of their vast empire. But as is often the case, the greatest strength also concealed the greatest vulnerability. Rome, in conquering peoples, unwittingly taught them. Roman discipline became a lesson for those who saw it up close. Roman tactics were picked apart by those who fought in the Roman auxiliary troops. Rome itself gave its future enemies everything they needed to win. It didn't just wage war, it was a school for its opponents, and the most talented among them became its best students. That is why there are several moments in the history of Rome that still cause surprise and controversy. Moments when the barbarians, whom the Romans despised and considered savage, inflicted crushing defeats on them. Two such examples are the Battle of Cannae and the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. They seem completely different, but in essence, they are the same lesson that Rome never fully learned. Watch this video to the end, and you will learn how Roman superiority led to the two most humiliating defeats in its history. The Roman military machine, perfect on paper and in open terrain, was confronted with a reality where not everything obeyed strict logic and order. Their strength lay in their ability to move in columns, build fortifications, and fight in close formation, which was deadly effective against scattered, undisciplined tribal militias. But when the Romans invaded territories where the landscape did not allow the legions to deploy, where there were no roads and where every path could be a trap, their superiority evaporated. The Romans were like a huge, heavily armored ship that could not maneuver in narrow channels. Their system of training and preparing soldiers also had its drawbacks. Legionnaires were trained to act as a single unit, like cogs in a huge machine. This made them incredibly effective in large-scale battles, but it also prevented them from showing initiative and adapting to unusual situations. In guerrilla warfare, where each soldier had to act independently and make quick decisions, Roman soldiers often found themselves at a loss. They were accustomed to relying on the orders of their commanders, clear instructions, and the support of their comrades in arms. Outside of formation, they lost their main strength. In addition, there was a psychological factor. The Romans believed in their invincibility. This belief, which helped them so much in battle, made them overconfident. They believed that their opponents, the barbarians, were incapable of complex strategy or cunning. They saw in them only savagery and fury, but not intelligence. This misconception led them to disregard warnings, fail to conduct sufficient reconnaissance, and not prepare for the enemy's unconventional moves. This blind self-confidence led to disaster more than once, and the Teutoburg Forest became its most striking manifestation. Roman technology itself, from roads to armor, created a kind of comfort zone in which the Romans felt invulnerable. They were accustomed to overcoming any obstacle with force and engineering genius. If there was a river in their way, they built a bridge. If there were mountains, they built a road. But what to do when the enemy does not want to fight? When he simply hides in the forest, attacks from ambush, and disappears without a trace? The Roman legion, like a tank opposed by a partisan with a grenade, was ineffective and vulnerable. Their military doctrine was based on the principle of suppression. The Roman army did not so much seek out the enemy's weak points as impose its own strengths on them. This tactic worked for decades. But when their enemies learned to avoid direct confrontation, when they began to use the terrain and speed to evade the Roman onslaught, the Roman machines ceased to be so effective. Roman weapons were so perfect that the Romans stopped learning. They thought that having the best equipment was enough to win. But history shows that intelligence and cunning can overcome any armor. Who do you think was the commander who inflicted the most damage on the Roman Empire in its entire history? Share your opinion in the comments and we'll discuss it. To understand how the Romans could be defeated, you first need to understand what they were. The Roman legion was not just a crowd of armed men. It was a complex, multi-level structure. 10 cohorts with 6 centuries in each. Each century consisted of 80 soldiers, where everything was planned down to the minute and step by step. A Roman soldier was not just a warrior. He was an engineer, a builder, a surveyor. He knew how to dig canals, build bridges, and construct siege towers. This gave Rome a tremendous advantage in long, protracted campaigns, while enemy armies had to search for food and sleep under the open sky. The Romans lived in fortified camps, had regular supplies, and could replenish their ranks. On the battlefield, the legion moved as a single unit. Manipuli, wedges, tortoises. Each of these formations was rehearsed to perfection. Shields were closed, spears were raised. In battle against an enemy unfamiliar with these tactics, the Romans were unbeatable. They ground down their enemies step by step, cutting off one part of the army after another. This remarkable discipline and structure allowed the Romans to always dominate the battlefield. Their tactics were based on slow but relentless pressure. The first line of the legion, consisting of young but strong soldiers, attacked, wearing down the enemy. Then it was replaced by the second line, more experienced warriors. And finally, when the enemy was already exhausted, the triarii, veterans whose appearance was always decisive, entered the battle. It was a strategy designed to exhaust and completely destroy the enemy. However, for this mechanism to work, one important condition was required: enough space to maneuver. The Romans were good at fighting on flat terrain, where they could form an ideal formation, deploy their cohorts, and apply their standard tactics. Their weapon, the short gladius sword, was deadly effective in close formation, where there was no room for sweeping blows and the enemies were within arm's reach. Roman scutum shields joined together created an almost impenetrable wall. But this tactic was useless in forests, swamps, or mountains. Imagine, instead of a flat plain, a narrow, winding path overgrown with bushes and trees. In such a place, it is impossible to form a manipulus, let alone an entire legion. Soldiers lost visual contact with each other, and their formation broke down into separate groups. Each warrior found himself in a situation where he had to act independently, which was extremely unusual for him. Moreover, in such terrain, Roman logistics, so perfect on the plains, also failed. The long convoys that transported food and equipment stretched for many kilometers, becoming an easy target for ambushes. The Roman army, accustomed to regular meals and strong camps, found itself in a situation where it had to fight not only the enemy, but also hunger, disease, and the terrain itself. Their strength turned into weakness, and their perfection into sluggishness. So the Roman legion was the ideal military machine for a certain type of warfare. But what happened when this machine found itself in unfavorable conditions? Watch this video to the end to find out the answer to this question. The Battle of Cannae is not just another battle. It is a lesson that is still studied in military academies today. And it is not a lesson about numbers, not a lesson about strength, but a lesson about thinking. The Romans fielded a colossal army against Hannibal. According to some estimates, it was almost twice the size of the Carthaginian army. It seemed that victory would be easy and quick, but Hannibal did not play by the Romans' rules. He did not launch a frontal attack or try to outflank them. He used their own strength against them. Hannibal placed the weakest part of his infantry in the center of his formation. He deliberately did this so that the Romans would see that their center was superior to the enemy's. The Roman legionaries, confident in their strength, began to advance, digging into the center of the Carthaginian forces. Hannibal allowed them to do so. His center began to retreat, but not in a disorderly fashion, rather in an organized manner, luring the Roman legions deeper and deeper. At that moment, the flanks of the Carthaginian army, consisting of experienced warriors, began to close in. Hannibal turned the perfect Roman formation into a disorderly mass. At the same time, his cavalry put the Roman horsemen to flight and closed in on the rear of the Roman army. The Roman legions found themselves trapped. They could not move, they could not maneuver. Their weapons became useless. Rome's largest army was destroyed by smaller forces that, however, thought completely differently. It was a lesson that strategy and tactics can be stronger than numerical superiority. Hannibal's success lay not in brute force, but in a deep understanding of his opponent's psychology. He knew that Roman commanders, confident in the superiority of their infantry, would seek a direct confrontation, and he gave them that opportunity, but on his terms. By forming a concave formation, he created the illusion of weakness in the center, which the Romans could not help but respond to. The Roman legions, following their standard tactics, moved forward to destroy what appeared to be easy prey. But as they advanced, their formation became increasingly dense, and their flanks increasingly vulnerable. The Romans, focused on the center, paid no attention to what was happening on the sides. They were so confident of victory that they did not notice how they were gradually being trapped. When the Carthaginian flanks began to close in, the Romans found themselves in a so-called double envelopment. It was one of the deadliest tactics in the history of warfare, and the Romans were not prepared for it. Their weapon, the short gladius sword, was only effective at close range, and their dense formation, which made them invincible in a head-on collision, became their curse. Squeezed on all sides, the legionaries could not maneuver, could not use their shields, could not fight effectively. Their combat power was neutralized. They became a helpless crowd that Hannibal could destroy methodically and without loss. The Battle of Cannae is also a lesson in the role of cavalry. The Romans always underestimated cavalry. They believed that infantry played the main role on the battlefield. Hannibal, on the contrary, had excellent cavalry, which, after defeating the Roman horsemen, played a key role in surrounding the Roman legions. This element of tactics, which the Romans considered secondary, proved to be decisive in the battle. Hannibal showed that to win, you need to use all available resources, rather than relying on just one type of troops. Hannibal did not simply win the battle. He clearly showed the Romans that their ideal military machine had its vulnerabilities, and that to defeat it, one needed not more force, but more intelligence. He did not simply defeat them, he made them doubt their own tactics and strategy. Cannae was not just a humiliating defeat for Rome, but also a kind of awakening. If Cannae was a battle in open field, then the battle in the Teutoburg forest was its complete opposite. It was not a battle, but an ambush. And here again we see how Rome's strength turns into its weakness. 3 Roman legions, under the command of Publius Quinctilius Varro, were marching through Germanic lands. Varro was an experienced administrator, but not a military commander. He underestimated his enemy, considering them to be scattered and incapable of organized action. He did not listen to warnings and marched in his usual formation, stretching for many kilometers along a narrow road. Germanic troops under the command of Arminius, whom the Romans considered one of their own, suddenly attacked the marching legions. The location was ideal. The narrow passage, overgrown with trees, turned the legionaries into easy targets. They had nowhere to form battle lines, nowhere to maneuver. The legionaries could not use their main strength, their disciplined formation. The Battle of the Teutoburg Forest is a perfect example of how landscape and surprise can neutralize superiority in weaponry and organization. The Roman legions, which were invincible on flat fields, were helpless in the dense forest. Their tight formation, which made them invulnerable, became a trap. The soldiers could not use their swords effectively because the trees got in the way. Their shields, designed to protect against frontal attacks, did not save them from attacks from the side and rear. The Germanic tribes, on the other hand, were masters of forest warfare. They did not have heavy weapons and did not fight in dense ranks. Their tactics were based on speed and surprise. They attacked from ambush, delivering quick blows, and disappeared just as quickly, dissolving into the dense thicket. The Romans could not catch up with them or oppose them in open battle. The Roman army, stretched out along the road for many kilometers, turned into a chain of isolated detachments, which the Germans could attack one by one. Another important factor was the Roman attitude toward the Germans. The Romans considered them wild and primitive, incapable of complex strategic decisions. They could not even imagine that the Germans could unite and develop a plan that would lead to the destruction of 3 legions. Varro ignored the warnings, considering them insignificant. He did not believe that Arminius, a Roman citizen, could betray him. This self-confidence and arrogance, based on a sense of cultural and military superiority, led to disaster. Varro was confident that his soldiers, as former inhabitants of the camp, would be able to cope with any difficulties. However, he did not take into account that in such conditions, they would have to fight not only the enemy, but also nature itself. The weather, mud, and swamps all worked against the Romans. Their heavy armor, which gave them an advantage in open combat, became a burden in the forest. The battle in the Teutoburg Forest was not just a defeat, but a real shock for Rome. It was the first major defeat inflicted by barbarians. It showed that the Roman military machine was not invincible, and that effective weapons could be found against it. These weapons were intelligence, cunning, and knowledge of the terrain. The Romans were accustomed to relying on their discipline, their weapons, and their numbers. But the Teutoburg Forest showed that these factors were not always decisive. How did it happen that the disciplined and trained Roman legions were unable to cope with troops that they themselves considered primitive? Let's talk about the school for Roman enemies right now. One of the most important and subtle lessons that Cannae and Teutoburg teach us is that Rome itself trained its enemies. It didn't just wage war, it drew conquered peoples into its system. And many of them, like Hannibal and Arminius, went through this system. Hannibal was raised in a family that saw Rome as its main enemy. From childhood, he studied Roman tactics, saw how the Roman army worked, and knew all its strengths and weaknesses. He knew that he could not win in open battle, so he devised his own plan, which allowed him to lure the Roman army into a trap. Arminius, or Germanicus as the Romans called him, was not just the leader of a Germanic tribe. He was a Roman citizen, he served in the Roman army, he was a horseman, and he knew Latin. He was part of the Roman system, and that's what allowed him to understand how the Roman army worked, how its commanders thought, and what their weaknesses were. He used his knowledge to lure the Romans into a trap. He knew that Varro would march in formation, that he would be overconfident and ignore warnings. He used that overconfidence against Varro himself. The Roman system was structured in such a way that it unwittingly created the conditions for its own defeat. As Rome expanded its empire, it assimilated the conquered peoples. It took their young men into its auxiliary troops, teaching them Roman tactics, discipline, and weaponry. Thousands of Germans, Gauls, and Spaniards served in the Roman army, side by side with the legionaries. They saw how the Romans built camps, how they moved around the territory, how they organized supplies. They saw how the Roman military machine worked from the inside, which gave them invaluable knowledge. They learned not only military skills, but also the Roman way of thinking. They saw Roman pride, their self-confidence, their belief in their own superiority, and they knew that this self-confidence was their main weakness. They understood that the Romans would underestimate an enemy who, in their opinion, was incapable of complex maneuvers. And it was this knowledge that they used against them. Hannibal, despite never having been a Roman citizen, was part of the Roman world. He knew how Roman diplomats worked, how they negotiated, how they used their propaganda. He knew that the Romans would believe in their numerical superiority and seek a direct confrontation. He did not play by their rules. He created his own tactics, which were based on his knowledge of the strengths and weaknesses of the Romans. Arminius, on the other hand, was a true product of the Roman system. He was raised as a Roman, spoke Latin, and even bore a Roman name. He had access to the highest circles of Roman society. This allowed him not only to study Roman military tactics, but also to understand Roman psychology. He knew that Varro, as an experienced administrator, would rely on order and discipline rather than intuition or cunning. He knew that Varro would ignore warnings from those he considered inferior to himself. Thus, Rome, without realizing it, was training its enemies. It gave them the knowledge and skills that allowed them to fight Rome on equal terms. It led them into its camps, showed them its secrets, and then was surprised when they used that knowledge against it. This lesson was very painful, and Rome seemed to have learned it. But history, as we know, likes to repeat itself. Arminius was not just a leader, he was a diplomat and a scout. He knew that the scattered Germanic tribes would not be able to resist Rome individually. He used his Roman education, his Latin speech, and his experience to convince the chiefs to unite. He showed them that Rome was not so strong, that it could be defeated. It was Arminius who convinced Varro that all was calm and that he should continue deeper into the forest. He acted as a guide and advisor, and Varro trusted him. Arminius knew that the Roman legions would not be able to fight effectively in the forest, that their formation would be disrupted, and that their combat power would be reduced. He used his knowledge of the terrain to set up the perfect ambush. Arminius double game. His ability to simultaneously serve Rome and prepare a rebellion against it is one of the key elements of this whole story. Unlike Hannibal, who was an open enemy of Rome, Arminius acted secretly from within. He was part of Roman society and enjoyed the trust of Varro and other Roman commanders. He was a kind of sleeper agent who waited for his moment to strike. His unique position allowed him not only to learn about Varro's plans, but also to influence them. He convinced Varro to take the very road that led to the trap. Arminius skillfully exploited the weaknesses of the Roman system. He knew that Varro, as an experienced administrator, was accustomed to order and believed in the effectiveness of bureaucracy. He knew that Varro would rely on official reports and advice rather than rumors or intuition. That is why Arminius was able to convince Varro that everything was under control and that he had nothing to worry about. He played the role of a loyal ally and advisor, which allowed him to distract Varro's attention from the real threat. In addition, Arminius was a charismatic leader and a brilliant orator. He knew how to talk to the Germanic chiefs, how to convince them to put aside their internal differences and unite against a common enemy. He did not simply call them to battle, he gave them hope and showed them that victory was possible. He used his knowledge of Rome to dispel the Germans' fear of its power. He explained to them that the Roman Empire, despite its strength, had vulnerabilities and could be defeated if they acted together and intelligently. Arminius also understood that in order to defeat the Romans, it was necessary not only to fight, but also to use psychology. He knew that the Romans would be overconfident and that they would underestimate their opponent. He used this overconfidence against them, convincing Varro to lead his legions to a place where they would be most vulnerable. He didn't just develop an ambush tactic, he created the perfect conditions for it. But what enabled him to convince local chiefs to unite and oppose Rome? Stay with us. We'll tell you about the psychological techniques and problems of the Roman Empire in just a minute. One of the key factors in Rome's defeats was its own overconfidence. The Romans were convinced of their superiority. They believed that all other peoples were barbarians, savage and disorganized. This overconfidence prevented them from seeing the real threat. Varro did not believe in the possibility of an uprising. He was sure that the Germans feared Rome and would not dare to oppose it. His own people, his legates, warned him that something was wrong, but he ignored their words. He could not imagine that a barbarian he knew and trusted could deceive him. This overconfidence cost Rome 3 legions. The same thing happened at Cannae. The Roman consuls were confident that their numerical superiority would guarantee victory. They believed that Hannibal, with his small and motley army, would be no match for the might of Rome. This overconfidence led them to launch a frontal attack without considering tactics and strategy. Rome's arrogance had deep roots. It was the result of centuries of successful conquests, which had created a strong belief among the Romans in their invincibility. Roman propaganda and education instilled in every citizen the idea that the Roman legion was the pinnacle of military thought and that Roman commanders were geniuses of strategy. This worked as long as the Romans faced less organized opponents. But when they encountered opponents who were their equals or more intelligent, this blind faith became their greatest enemy. Varro, like many Roman commanders, was a product of this system. He was convinced that his task was not to seek out the enemy, but simply to advance, and the enemy would be crushed by the power of his legions. He did not take Arminius seriously, considering him to be nothing more than a local prince. He could not imagine that a barbarian was capable of such a complex and multi-step plan. This arrogance was so deep that Varro ignored even obvious signs of impending disaster, such as alarming reports from scouts and warnings from allies. A similar situation occurred at Cannae. The Roman consuls Varro and Emilius were so confident of victory that they even quarreled over the best way to achieve it. They had no doubt that they would be able to defeat Hannibal. They did not consider that Hannibal might have his own plan. They only saw their numerical superiority and believed that this was enough to win. As a result, they fell into the trap that Hannibal had set for them. They acted according to a pattern, and Hannibal knew it. Ultimately, Rome's self-confidence led it to stop learning. It stopped adapting to new conditions and new tactics. It believed that its system was perfect and did not need to be changed. This delusion cost it not only 3 legions, but also hundreds of thousands of lives. The Romans, who were once flexible and pragmatic, became rigid and dogmatic. They relied on force when intelligence was needed. They relied on numbers when cunning was needed. That was their biggest mistake. Rome was so confident in its superiority that it could not even imagine that anyone could be smarter. It saw only brute force in its opponents, not tactical genius. This blindness cost it dearly. In the end, the Romans realized that even the most perfect military machine cannot win if it is driven by self-confidence and arrogance. The battle in the Teutoburg Forest was a guerrilla battle. The Germanic warriors did not try to fight the Romans face-to-face. They used tactics of ambushes, attacks, and retreats. They appeared out of nowhere and disappeared into the forest. For the Romans, this was not just unusual, it was impossible. A legion could only fight in formation. Without it, it was just a bunch of individual warriors who couldn't defend themselves or attack effectively. Roman soldiers were trained to act as a single unit, not as individual fighters. Their weapons, heavy pilums and short swords, were effective in close combat, but useless against archers and slingers who attacked from a distance. Guerrilla warfare is a type of warfare where it is not necessary to win every battle. It is enough to simply wear down the enemy, inflicting constant small blows that will eventually lead to their defeat. This is exactly what the Germanic tribes did. The Roman army, with all its discipline and organization, was designed to counter open armies that fought according to certain rules. They were used to the enemy coming out onto the field, forming their ranks, and preparing for battle. In such conditions, the Romans were invincible. Their shields, their formations, their heavy weapons, everything worked like clockwork. But when the enemy did not want to fight by their rules, the entire Roman system began to fail. The Germans did not have heavy weapons, they did not have strict discipline, but they had something more important: knowledge of the terrain and the ability to use it as a weapon. They knew every hill, every hollow, every tree in the forest. They used this terrain as cover, as a base for their operations. The Romans, on the other hand, were strangers in this forest. They did not know the roads. They could not find their way around. They were like blind men in this dense, dark forest. For the Romans, guerrilla tactics were not only unfamiliar, they were dishonorable. They believed that battles should be fought in open combat, face to face. The Germans, on the other hand, used every opportunity to strike. They attacked supply trains, lone soldiers, and small detachments. They did not seek a great victory. They simply wore down the Romans, depriving them of food, equipment, and morale. This was the genius of Arminius. He understood that a large army was not necessary to defeat the Romans. It was enough to exploit their own weaknesses. He knew that Rome could not fight effectively in the forest, that its army would be stretched thin and vulnerable. He exploited this weakness to deliver a blow that shook the entire Roman Empire. The Romans were not just facing a Germanic army. They were facing a style of warfare they had never seen before, where there was no single front line and no clear enemy. They were defeated not by force, but by cunning and tactics they could not even imagine. Moreover, guerrilla tactics had a demoralizing effect on the Roman army. The constant feeling of threat, the invisible enemy that could attack at any moment, wore down the soldiers' nerves. Roman legionnaires were trained to act confidently and coolly, but when the enemy could not be seen and could not be fought in open battle, they began to doubt their own strength. Morale fell, and with it, combat effectiveness. The Germans used not only physical warfare, but also psychological warfare, and in this they surpassed the Romans. This tactic was so effective that Rome was forced to completely change its strategy in Germanic lands. After the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, they stopped trying to conquer these territories. Instead, they built defensive structures, such as the limes, and focused on protecting their borders. This was an admission that they were losing the guerrilla war. It was a bitter but necessary lesson that Rome finally learned. Cannae and Teutoburg are not only lessons in tactics, but also lessons in leadership. On one side were brilliant commanders who thought outside the box, who were not afraid to take risks and use unpredictability. Hannibal and Arminius were both masters of their craft. They were not Romans, but they knew the Romans better than they knew themselves. On the other side were representatives of the Roman system who were trained to do only one thing: follow the rules. Varro and the Roman consuls at Cannae were experienced military leaders, but they were not geniuses. They followed the rules, they relied on strength rather than intelligence, and that is what led to their defeat. Leadership is not just the ability to lead people, it is also the ability to see the big picture, the ability to adapt to changing conditions, the ability to use the enemy's strengths against them. Hannibal and Arminius were leaders of a new type. They did not rely on numbers or superior weaponry. Their strength lay in their minds and their ability to think outside the box. They understood that to defeat Rome, they needed not just to fight it, but to outmaneuver it. Hannibal lured the Romans into a trap, exploiting their own self-confidence and dogmatism. Arminius exploited their trust and their ignorance of the terrain. Both were masters of their craft, and their genius lay in seeing what the Romans could not see. Roman commanders, on the other hand, were representatives of a system that encouraged order and discipline rather than genius. They were good administrators. They knew how to command large armies, but they did not know how to think like adversaries. Varro, for example, was an experienced official who was accustomed to everything being done by the book. He could not imagine that a barbarian could be smarter than him. He could not believe that his trusted advisor could betray him. This blind faith in the system and its rules cost him his life. The consuls at Cannae, Varro, and Aemilius were also products of the Roman system. They could not agree among themselves on the best way to fight Hannibal. One wanted to attack, the other to wait. They were so confident of victory that they could not even imagine that Hannibal might have his own plan. They acted according to a pattern, and Hannibal knew it. He used their disagreements and their self-confidence to lure them into a trap. Hannibal and Arminius' leadership lay in their ability to inspire their people, to convince them that victory was possible even when all the odds were against them. Hannibal, with his small, motley army, was able to defeat the largest army Rome had ever fielded. Arminius, with his scattered tribes, was able to defeat 3 Roman legions. It was not just a victory, it was a demonstration that intelligence and cunning can overcome any force. Their leadership qualities were evident not only in their tactics, but also in their ability to influence others psychologically. Hannibal masterfully manipulated the minds of the Romans, making them believe that his army was on the verge of defeat, thereby pushing them into a decisive but misguided attack. Arminius, in turn, used his reputation as a loyal Roman ally to lull Varus into a false sense of security and convince him to walk into a deadly trap. This was leadership based not on brute force, but on subtle calculation and an understanding of human nature. They were not just commanders, they were innovators. They were not afraid to deviate from the accepted rules and come up with something new, even if it seemed crazy. The Romans, on the other hand, were conservatives. They believed in the power of tradition and the infallibility of their tactics. It was this difference in thinking that led to 2 of the largest armies in Roman history being defeated by smaller but smarter opponents. Ultimately, Cannae and the Teutoburg Forest are lessons that victory requires not only a strong army, but also the ability to command it. You need to be a leader who can think outside the box, who can adapt to changing conditions, who can use the enemy's strengths against them. Hannibal and Arminius were just such leaders, and they were able to inflict the most humiliating defeats in Rome's history. Cannae and the Teutoburg Forest were not just defeats. They were harbingers of the decline of a great empire. These events, separated in time, demonstrate an alarming pattern. Rome, once flexible and pragmatic, was becoming increasingly dogmatic and incapable of change. It was like an old, mighty oak tree that grows stronger with age but loses its ability to bend in the wind. After Cannae, Rome learned its lesson. It revised its tactics, began to use more cautious strategies, and ultimately, thanks to the military genius of Scipio Africanus, was able to defeat Hannibal. But this was a temporary enlightenment. Over time, as Rome became the sole dominant power in the Mediterranean, it fell back into complacency. It began to believe that its army and its system were invincible. The barbarian peoples that Rome later encountered were not like the Carthaginians. They did not seek open battle, preferring tactics of ambush and surprise raids. Rome, however, continued to operate according to the old rules. It sent its legions into swamps and forests where they could not fight effectively. It believed that the power of its weapons and the discipline of its soldiers could compensate for any shortcomings. This was Rome's main mistake. It stopped learning and stopped adapting. It became too confident in its strength, too proud to admit that its enemies might be smarter. This led to a series of defeats which, although not as large-scale as Cannae, seriously damaged the prestige and power of the empire. In the end, Rome fell not because of one great defeat, but because of a series of mistakes that it repeated over and over again. These mistakes were compounded by internal problems. Economic crisis, political instability, and social stratification weakened the empire from within. While external enemies became increasingly organized and skilled, Rome itself was preoccupied with power struggles. The legions, once a symbol of unity, were now being used in civil wars. Officers who had once been loyal to Rome now served their commanders rather than the emperor. The Roman army, once invincible, became a symbol of disintegration and chaos. Rome, once the pinnacle of civilization, had become a rigid giant, unable to withstand new, more flexible and unpredictable threats. Its defeats in the Teutoburg Forest and then in numerous battles with the Goths and Vandals were not accidental but a consequence of its own evolution. The empire that had built roads to move its troops quickly now found that those same roads were being used by its enemies for swift raids. The system that had once been its strength became its greatest weakness. It was an agony that lasted for centuries, and each defeat, from the Teutoburg Forest to the sacking of Rome, was a new, more painful manifestation of it. Thus, Cannae and the Teutoburg Forest became more than just historical events. They became harbingers of what would happen to Rome in the future. They showed that even the most powerful empire cannot exist forever if it is incapable of change and adaptation. These defeats were lessons that Rome seemed to have learned but then forgot. And it was this forgetfulness that led to its ultimate demise. So, the lessons of Teutoburg and Cannae are lessons about how genius and tactics can overcome numerical superiority. They are lessons about how the greatest strength can also be the greatest weakness. Most importantly, they are lessons about how Rome, in conquering the world, unwittingly raised those who would ultimately deal it its heaviest blows. The Roman Empire was so powerful that its only real teacher was itself, and its best students were its most talented enemies. If you like this episode, please subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what topic you would like to see in the next video. This will help us create even more exciting and informative content together.